Good morning, Dr. Twitchell.
Morning.
How are you doing today?
Good.
Good. We'll start off by keeping it simple. Could you tell us a little bit more of what your occupation is?
My occupation is to be an associate professor at Illinois State University, where I do two things. Well, sort of three things. Mainly, I teach information security and programming to students here at the university, and then I also do research in the area of information assurance and security. And then finally, I help out with the tasks that need to be done, like curriculum development or things like that with the department.
How long have you been a teacher, Dr. Twitchell?
Well, if you count the teaching that I did as a grad student, then about 8 years.
8 years.
Yeah.
You mentioned you teach information assurance and programming. Which one of those do you prefer to teach?
Well, actually, they're different enough that it's nice to have the variety of having two different kinds of things. So information security, being taught at the undergraduate level, is mainly a knowledge-based type situation where we teach facts, right? So you can learn facts about how information security works. There's a little bit of skill in trying to understand how and learning the technology and that sort of stuff, but it's mostly fact-based, and that's what we do our exams on and that sort of thing. Whereas programming is most definitely skill-based, where we're trying to teach you how to do something. Like somebody teaches somebody else how to play basketball. We're teaching you how to program a computer. And that's definitely a skill. And so they're different enough that I enjoy going back and forth.
So you would say programming involves a little bit more thinking as for the undergrad level.
Yeah, I mean, programming does. It's definitely more problem solving from the standpoint of solving sort of puzzles, whereas security, when you get out into industry, is a lot of problem solving, and so those skills are necessary. But we don't have full-on systems here necessarily to do the problem solving with. So we do online. We do labs where we do solve problems, and we kind of try to teach the skill of going out and trying to figure out how to solve a security problem and that sort of thing. So we do have some skill in there, but much of it is fact-based.
Dr. Twitchell, if you were to explain information assurance to the average person, how would you explain it?
Well, information assurance or information security?
Let's go with security.
Okay, we'll start off with security. So information security is the preservation of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information.
How did you get interested in this kind of field?
Well, when I started my graduate work at the University of Arizona, about 12 years ago, I started on a program or a project that they were doing with the U.S. government, looking at deception. So how people lie to each other, especially online. So online in 2001, the internet world was still fairly new. And so we were looking at how people deceived online. And so that had a lot of security aspects to it. And sort of an adversary and trying to protect information. Deception is also a way of reducing security, because then people believe things that aren't true, and so they don't have true information and that sort of stuff. And so I worked on that throughout my PhD program, and I still do research in that area, in the area of online deception. But that led me to the broader world of information security, which involves more than just deception. So deception is a small piece of it, though.
Which is what you teach here at ISU now.
Yeah, I teach the full broad range of information security.
Dr. Twitchell, in today's computer world, you could say there's a lot of threats. Mm-hmm. What would you personally think would be like the number one threat for the average computer user?
So for the average computer user,
yes.
I think that the number one threat is like bank and credit card fraud. Okay, now, but the problem with that, with saying that is a threat to the average user, is that the average user doesn't end up paying when that happens.
No.
So it isn't necessarily a threat to them so much as it is a threat to their banks. Because it will take some time, and it is kind of a hassle, and you have to some extent, not necessarily prove, but you have to indicate that it wasn't necessarily your charge and that sort of thing that occurred. I also think that there's a big threat to what we call scareware, and this is both semi-legitimate and legitimate types of schemes out there. And the scheme is that you are led to believe that either there is a virus on your computer or that there is some sort of problem with your computer, and the average user, not being knowledgeable in the area, is likely to believe that that is the case, and then claiming that the software will solve that problem for a fee. And so a lot of this sort of pops up on when you're online and that sort of thing, compromised websites and so on, that distribute what we call scareware. But there's also sort of legitimate programs out there that claim to be like software for cleaning your computer, right? And they will find all kinds of problems that aren't really problems, and then charge you for doing stuff that you could do on your own. So I think that's one of that's one of the ways that money is fraudulently extracted from the average user in a way that's not honest or forthcoming and that sort of thing.
How could the average user protect themselves from this?
Well, I think the average user needs to be wary. But in today's world, we lose that physical proximity. Right, so even if we, by experience or by even study, find that 99.9% of all people are inherently good and would not defraud anybody or anything like that, you still have this You have this 0.1% of the people that would, right? If that's your belief. And that 0.1% of 1%, if you multiply that by the number of internet users that are out there, which is what, 1 billion, 2 billion, or something like that these days,
that's small.
And then that's a lot of people, right? And that lots of people are then going to have the ability and the means by which to try to defraud you, right? Because you are just as available to them as the guy next door, and that sort of stuff. So that's one of the big problems, is that we don't have a way of evaluating the trust of people or institutions or organizations that we encounter on the internet.
These days you see a lot of antiviruses, Norton, Sysantec.
Yeah.
Which one do you think does a better job of protecting?
They're all equivalently bad. So they served a very good purpose over the say from 1995 until say 2008, 2009 or something like that, because the amount of malware was somewhat small and they could detect a lot of that malware and that sort of thing. And so that was their idea. The idea behind antivirus is that there are viruses that exist, and so you set up a detection mechanism, and that detection mechanism is based on a signature, so sort of like a fingerprint of the virus. And so of course you have to have the virus first before you can have the fingerprint. Well, and that worked for a long while until viruses got a lot smarter. So malware these days, which is what we call all types of viruses and worms and other types of ways of getting on a computer and compromising information or a computer. Malware these days has the ability to change itself and encrypt itself, and so the same virus or piece of malware that we're trying to detect today is going to be changed tomorrow.
Sounds like almost like a living organism.
Yes, and the amount of what we call malware variants. So you could think of it as like different forms of the flu virus or something like that. Has gone from say several thousand 10 years ago to many thousands per day, right? And no virus detection program can keep up with that using those types of detection mechanisms, the signature-based mechanism. So antivirus, no matter which brand it is for the most part, necessary on a lot of systems, but not sufficient. And so the operating systems themselves are becoming more savvy. So Windows has a lot of built-in security that is actually more important than the antivirus.
So I'll keep updating your Windows updates.
That's right.
Windows
When it pops up and says there's an update, do the update.
Just do the update.
Same with Java and with Adobe Acrobat Reader and Adobe Flash and those sort of standard programs that almost everybody has. You got to keep those updated at all times.
Very good. Dr. Twitchell, the NSA has been popping up in the news in the past couple of years more often than normally did in the early 90s and so on. Could you tell us a little bit what the NSA does and why you think they're more important now than ever?
Well, the National Security Agency has been around for a long time. Started after World War II, but wasn't really in the public eye, and in fact was specifically denied until the mid-'80s and that sort of time period. And they started off essentially as a mechanism for gathering signals intelligence. So what do we mean by signals intelligence? So when armies and others communicate with each other, they do it over telephone lines or via radio waves or things like that. And the National Security Agency was set up to capture the telephone communications, the radio stuff, and so on. And so they set up sensors around the world, and captured a lot of this stuff, so that they could comb through it looking for information that they were interested in. And they also were focused on decrypting that information. So if that information is encrypted, then obviously you can't read it. And so they have, I believe the National Security Agency is one of the biggest hirers or employers of mathematicians. So they hire mathematicians to try to break the encryption using computer tools and that sort of thing. So that's where that's their history. Since the internet has come to the fore, the National Security Agency has kind of been on the forefront of both defending the U.S. government's assets from hacking attacks and also doing those types of attacks on others.
Right.
And in fact, working for them, doing almost anything requires a security clearance. And so you're not able to talk about pretty much anything that they do. But we do have some ideas of what they do and that sort of thing. And so on the defensive side, one of the things that they do publish are they help publish standards for defending against attacks. And specifically, they're looking at what we call high assurance platforms. These are computing systems that are built to be extremely robust against known and unknown attacks. And what I mean by unknown are those that have yet to be devised. They are also trying to create an educated workforce that will be able to work not only in the National Security Agency but across the U.S. government and also industry for helping to defend computing systems wherever they might be.
So when you, let's say when you were early in your career, do you ever have an interest to work for them?
For the National Security Agency? Not really, because I kind of set my eyes on the academic world, and it's not the academic world. Though I do a lot with them here at the university. We're a Center of Academic Excellence and Information Assurance Education. Now, what does that mean? That means the National Security Agency has come up with criteria that universities are supposed to adhere to and prove that they follow and that sort of thing. And then if you do, then you get this designation. And part of that designation is that you go and you meet with them and they meet with you and that sort of thing. And so I have worked with them, but mainly on ensuring that our curriculum meets, follows their standards, so that we're producing the kind of workforce that they think that we need.
Do you think the U.S. overall, you think we are prepared for most attacks we receive these days?
Well, from a consumer standpoint, you and I and the people that we live with and that sort of stuff, I think that there are lots of problems. And yeah, I think actually at every level there are lots of problems. There have been several high-profile attacks that have resulted in information being compromised. One of the most high-profile and controversial as to whether it was a good thing or a bad thing was the WikiLeaks stuff that happened a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So, we look at the StuxNet, which is a piece of malware that was found in Iran, and its purpose. I mean, if you look into the code, its purpose was to shut down, or at least severely compromise, the ability of Iran to enrich uranium. That's all it did. And it was a very complex piece of malware to do that. And so people in the security community early on were saying that this must have been, the only people who have the resources to build this kind of attack would have been nations. Right? And who is interested in shutting down Iran's uranium enrichment? Well,
dominantly the U.S.
The U.S. and Israel are pretty much the ones who are interested in doing that. So that's what they surmised from up front. So there was a lot of talk about that. And then the New York Times also reported that they had sources that said that it was indeed the U.S. government. So that attack, Stuxnet, was a piece of malware that was very successful at doing what it did. It did delay Iranian uranium enrichment, and but it also caused sort of collateral damage in that it had infected lots of places that weren't necessarily meant to be infected. Not that it did anything to them, but they were infected. And because it was very specific in what it was targeting, and so if it wasn't in the right place, it didn't do anything. It just sat there.
I believe it was Siemens computers.
That's right. It was looked at for Siemens programmable logic controllers. These are the things that actually control mechanical devices, and in this case, the centrifuges that enrich uranium is what they were trying to get at. And they have motors on them, and those motors, the frequency of the rotation of those motors was controlled by a computer. That's exactly what this piece of malware was looking for. It was looking for a very specific one, the very one that was used in Iran. And coming back to the point there is that, so I'm sure that the U.S. government considers that a great success. And maybe many of us as citizens consider that a great success. But if you're Iran, you don't consider that a great success. No. Right? And so when it comes to nation states and this, this idea of cyber warfare, then it's not as clear cut. We don't necessarily have the bad guys and the good guys. Where when you have somebody defrauding somebody else, that is stealing their money, I think from pretty universally we can recognize who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. And we have a lot of that as well. So there's kind of two fronts that we're working with in information security: the people who want to just steal money, and the people, or make money somehow in a fraudulent manner, and the people who want to politically attack other people for whatever reason.
Everyone has their own agenda these days.
That's right.
Let's go back to Stuxnet.
Mm-hmm.
What was so radical about it?
Well, Stuxnet, and there's another piece of malware called Flame that has been linked to it. And Flame actually came before Stuxnet, though it was discovered after. And Flame was, where Stuxnet, as we discussed, was aimed at disrupting uranium enrichment. Flame was an espionage tool. That is, its purpose was to spy. And it did so by recording using microphones that were on computers, and taking screenshots of what was on computers, and dumping any file that was on the computer. And it did this successfully for about 5 years before being discovered.
Wow. And
so, and Flame and Stuxnet also share some of the same code. But what's what's significant about both of these? Well, both of these, StuxNet used at least 3 what we call zero-day vulnerabilities. And a zero-day vulnerability is one that we don't know about. Okay? So one that is more than a zero-day vulnerability is one that we found out about and we're trying to fix. Okay? But a zero-day vulnerability is one that we don't know about until it's being exploited, until somebody does something about it, and or until somebody attacks it, I should say. And so the StuxNet used 3 of these, and these are not easy to create, right? So it takes a lot of resources to do that. Also, the ability to be able to target something very specific means that you would have to have one of those things. So in order to be able to specifically target not only the specific Siemens programmable, or PLC, we'll just call it programmable logic controller, but also the environment in which it's being operated, the nuclear power plant that it was being operated in, requires you to set up kind of a test bed. That is, you have to have that equipment too, to be able to try to successfully attack it. So that means that whoever did it had to buy the equipment, set up a test bed, ensure that it worked, and it was targeted in such a way that it was not detected for a long time. And that's also something that's very difficult to do. And they used various different means for doing that. If you take a look at the internals of StuxNet, it's not necessarily large per se, but it uses a lot of techniques that some of which have never been used before. So like I said, we see thousands upon thousands of samples of malware all the time, right? Well, StuxNet was far and above most of those, all of them, in fact, from at the time that it was discovered, which is why it got the attention that it did. So that's one thing. With Flame, which was, as I said, was related to StuxNet, but did espionage rather than target a specific thing. Flame had actually a very specific cryptographic attack in it. And what we mean by that is somebody actually had to have fairly extensive knowledge of cryptography, how it worked, and they performed a very sophisticated cryptographic attack that allowed Flame to be downloaded as part of the normal Windows Update process. So when you go online and you say, Windows Update says there's an update, and you download and install that update, there's a mechanism that uses cryptography, that uses encryption to ensure that it is coming from Microsoft. So there's this chain of trust that's built up using encryption.
It authenticates it.
Yes, it authenticates and says that this update is most definitely coming from Microsoft. Well, Flame inserted itself into that chain of trust, that authentication mechanism, and in doing so, used an attack that was extremely sophisticated and would have required, that it actually only been, it was discovered about the same time, publicly that is, about the same time as Flame came out, 2008, 2007, and is a weakness in the particular protocol that was used. And it required millisecond accuracy in being able to obtain what we call a certificate. So they had to obtain a certificate within milliseconds of time in order for it to look just right so it would pass through. And required mathematical knowledge of how the cryptography worked. So it wasn't just, just some dude trying to make some money or something like that. It was very sophisticated and one of the very few cryptographic attacks. Beyond just other types of cryptographic attacks would be those where we try to obtain secret material and use computing power to do that. And that usually requires a great deal of computing power and that sort of stuff. And most of the time it's impossible. But in this case, where it attacked the authentication mechanism, and it was very most people in the security world are impressed. We look at that and go, wow. It's like when somebody can do a half-court shot, at the end of the game and win the game in basketball or something like that. We're very impressed, even if we, it makes us also somewhat wary
Yeah.
at the same time, because they're like, wow, this is one of the more sophisticated mechanisms for ensuring security, and yet it has been compromised. And these are the attacks that we know about. What about the ones that we don't know about, right? The fact that we didn't know about Flame for 4 or 5 years and StuxNet for 2 or 3 years until they were discovered. Well, are there other attacks out there, right? And if the United States and Israel who are the likely instigators of both of those attacks, are involved in this, what about other sophisticated and developed nations such as China or Russia or Brazil or any of these countries that have a well-educated workforce that could bring in people and do exactly the same thing as what we have done.
It's changing times.
So we don't those are the things we don't know about, right? So.
Well, we could talk about StuxNet for hours because it's a very intriguing form of attack that got developed. Let's keep it down a little bit simpler now. In your professional experience, what is an attack that happened to you personally or that you witnessed on a computer?
Well, I've had a number of different attacks happen that I found early on. This was a long time ago, about 10 years ago. I had a computer, and this was back in the days of when the internet was sort of, I guess it was more than 10 years, more 12 years ago, right when I first started my PhD program. We had computers that were attached to the internet. And they didn't have firewalls, and everybody was, and that sort of thing. Everybody's kind of open and that kind of thing. And so I had my computer that I worked on. My own personal computer was attached to the internet in such a way that anybody on the internet could access it. And that's just how most computers were attached to the internet at that time. It wasn't like that was unusual or anything like that. That's just how it was. And at one point in time, I noticed a strange directory, in one of my computers, and I started going through, and it went very deep, right? So there's a directory under a directory under a directory under a directory under a directory, and each of these directories had very strange names. And I finally got down there to the point where there was actual files in there, and there was software and movies and stuff like that. So what somebody had done is somebody had compromised my computer in such a way that they had made it what's called a wares site, which is a way of distributing copyrighted materials. This is before Napster, before BitTorrent and all that sort of stuff. And so that was an attack on that machine, and we were able to clean it up and get rid of that. Essentially, what we did is we just did a full reinstall. Right, that's the easiest way to get rid of it. That's right. Format the hard, take off all your files, format the hard drive, reinstall Windows, put everything back on, and then you're at a clean slate.
My dad always used to say that's the safest way.
That's right. It is, and it still is. Still the best way to get rid of all that cruft and stuff that builds up. Almost all the malware that comes through today requires some sort of user intervention. That is, you have to do something. Like say yes to something,
or go to the wrong website,
or go to the wrong website. But even if you do go to the wrong website, you usually have to say yes. I want to download this thing to this movie, or I want to it requires some sort of an intervention.
All right, before we wrap this up, let's just focus a little bit more on the student aspect. As an educator in the field of information assurance here on campus, what do you find the most rewarding in teaching this field?
Information security specifically? Mm-hmm. Well, there are a couple of different things. One, people get excited about it. So the sort of good guys, bad guys aspect of it is something sort of fundamental that we all sort of enjoy, like cops and robbers and that sort of stuff. And so it gives you a very distinct and specific goal, and people like that. And so there are a lot of students that actually really enjoy it. And I enjoy that aspect of it as well. And then there's always a puzzle. There's always something new. Like, what did they say? There's always brand new malware, new attacks, new problems every day. Right? You go on, I have websites that I read where I get this information, and every day there's brand new news story about how this, some new attack, some new problem, some new vulnerability, some new way of defending against those vulnerabilities, and so it's exciting, right? There's always something new to see and to talk about, and I get stories that I'll be teaching something in class, or be preparing for it, and I'll see a story that relates directly to what we're going to talk about in class. So I can take that and say, here is where this is a problem.
So you like the ability to relate the knowledge you're teaching your students right now to current situations in the real world.
Yeah, like current right now situations.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's always fun.
What do you want your students to focus on as they're going through these classes?
Well, the attacks and the vulnerabilities and the technology is going to be continually changing. So number one, you got to learn how to learn, right? So you got to learn how to go and figure out things on your own. So, and that's one of the things I try to encourage in my classes. I give these labs, and these lab exercises, I don't spell out every step. So I specifically leave lots of stuff out, and just say things in generalities. Rather than saying click here, press this button, type in that, I say, download this and install it. Right? I don't give any instructions on how to do it. Right? So they have to go out and figure that out, and that's a lot. I mean, they can do that these days because you can go out and you can type it into Google and you can find 10 people who've already done it, right, and follow their instructions and that sort of thing. But what you have to learn is how the instructions and the tutorials and the things on the internet that you find relate to your specific problem, because it's never going to be the same.
No.
And so how to relate that to your problem is a skill that takes time to learn. And so that's something that I try to encourage in my class, is to learn how to learn how to figure things out, learn how to do the puzzles and that sort of thing that you need to do. And then the second thing is to focus on principles in the class. So we do teach, I use these labs where we use very specific technologies to do specific things and so on. But I want them to learn the principles behind that, because the technology is going to be different 3 years from now. And so you have to learn the principles that go along behind it so that you can understand security from a broad perspective and be able to apply it in various different areas.
To wrap it up here, Dr. Twitchell, any last words of encouragement to future potential information security students?
Let's see. One of the things you got to do is you got to tinker. You got to try to figure things out. So you have your own computer. Try new things. Install Linux. Try to do stuff that you've never done before, and that sort of stuff. Because that's how you learn. That's how you learn how to learn, is how to figure things out.
Very well. Well, Dr. Twitchell, thank you so much for coming in today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.